Cool. Thanks, everyone. Well, it's coming up to 7, so I'll just give it another minute before we kick off with Nikki. We'll do the introductions and just go through the format of the evening. I think there's a few people just joining now. Cool. Okay, so it's 7 o'clock, and I know Nikki has got an awful lot to get through. We have limited her to an hour's webinar, which is quite difficult for Nikki. So yeah, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second event of the Monmouthshire Regen Farming Group. Thanks very much to Marianne at the Monmouthshire Food Partnership and the Levelling Up funding has sort of helped with this webinar. So I'll be really quick so Nikki can get going. So Nikki is she'll introduce herself, but she is a grazing expert and guru. I was lucky enough to go on a course back last May or June time up in Wrexham that Nikki hosted for a day, and it completely changed how I manage my grazing, and I've seen lots of benefits from that. So the plan is for Nikki to do the webinar today. It'll be 45 minutes and then 15 minutes of questions at the end. If we don't get a chance to answer the question, we will sort of make a note of them, get Nikki to answer them, and we'll put them up on our Facebook page afterwards. So don't worry if your question doesn't get asked at the point. And like I say, this is being recorded, so we will send the recording round afterwards as well. So if you drop off or you have to not fall asleep, but if your internet dies, we will send you the recording afterwards. I apologize for being in my car. I've not had the day I planned, so I'm currently in Gordano services. So I will pass over to Nikki and she will go through the webinar. Thanks very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Scott. And it's brilliant to be here. I'm hoping you can all hear me okay. Yesterday I had some issues with my sound apparently, but I think hopefully it's resolved because Scott wasn't complaining earlier when we were having a chat. So I'm going to just very quickly share my screen, and that will give me the opportunity to make a start. So just bear with me 1 second while I get that loaded up. And I'm really hoping you can see Introduction to Rotational Grazing. Now, I was asked to come along and deliver this webinar. This could be a whole day. It could be multiple days worth of delivery. There's so much to cover. So hopefully I'm going to cover as much of the principles as I can over the next 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions, as Scott said. The webinar was titled as Rotational Grazing. I'm going to predominantly focus more on things like mob grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, just because there is quite a lot of information out there already about a kind of a 21-day rotational system. There's loads out there if you want to look for it. Hopefully this kind of development of a slightly longer rest periods and maybe more intensive grazing events just gives you a flavour, slightly different flavour from that kind of more rotational grazing, which many have got used to over the last few years. So a very quick introduction to me. That's me in the top right. If you're on Twitter, X, whatever it's called now, you'll find me at Hal Mill. I run Grampian Graziers with my husband, and I also work for Pasture for Life, overseeing and supporting all of their work in research. And I'm currently also doing a PhD through the Countryside and Community Research Institute that is in part supported by the Soil Association. I also sit on the board of Nature Scott, so quite a lot going on, but all of it very related to ecology, grazing, agroecology, regenerative agriculture. So hopefully the things that I've learned over the last kind of 5-6 years, delivering this sort of this grazing approach and through the work that I'm doing with Pasture for Life will give you a good overview of what this approach is. Now, I just want to start with some key terms. So these, for some of you, you will know this already, but for some of you, it might be really new. So I just wanted to go through these key terms so that when I'm rabbiting on over the next 40 minutes or so, you don't think, what on earth is she talking about? So the first one that I want to mention is grazing platform. Now, grazing platform relates to the fields on the farm that are grazed. So rather than thinking, for example, if we have a 200-acre farm, we're not going to say that we're necessarily grazing all 200 acres. There might be other parts of it that we're not grazing. So if we've got, I don't know, 50 acres of woodland on a 200-acre farm, and the rest is grassland, then our grazing platform would be 150 acres. So it's basically whatever we're bringing into play to graze that year. The next one is covers. That basically relates to the grass that's in the field when you go into a field. So as you go into a paddock, into a subdivision, into a field, what you've got in front of you, the grass that's in front of you, that's your covers. And then the residual is the grass that is left after you graze. So when you move those animals out and you take them into the next paddock or the next field, then what you've left behind is your residual. The kind of line an X day rotation, like a 30-day rotation or a 180-day rotation, that relates to basically the number of days rest a field gets or a paddock gets before it's regrazed, and also can in the same way relate to how long it takes you to get around all of those paddocks. So and they mean the same thing. So if I was going to say I've got a 90-day rotation, it means from this paddock to get all the way around the paddocks I'm going to graze back to that paddock is going to be 90 days, which basically if I'm on a if I'm moving them daily, that gives me that 89 days rest before I come back onto that first paddock. A back fence, the most important bit of kit in my view that you can have to prevent the risk of overgrazing. So this is the fence that you put up behind animals. So if you're strip grazing, and there are certain times of the year where this might not be appropriate, and we'll cover that. But a back fence during the growing season is a really, really important bit of kit that basically stops animals from going back to what they've already grazed, which will then lead to them overgrazing. And then the final one is stocking rate versus stocking density, often used interchangeably, but actually means slightly different things. So stocking rate generally means the amount of land allotted to each animal for the entire grazable portion of the year, whereas stocking density is the number of or the amount of land allotted to each animal at a specific point in time. So you can have quite a low stocking rate across the entire farm, but actually each day that you're grazing, you might have a high stocking density where you're putting animals into small paddocks, for example. If there are questions about that, then please do chuck them into the Q&A. So yeah, that's a good point to say that actually there is a Q&A button. You should see that. So if you have questions, that's where you need to put those questions, type them in, and we'll pick them up as we go through towards the end of the session. Okay, so those are our key terms, and I think this presentation will be shared with you all as well. But what we're going to be talking mostly about today is this idea of graze and rest systems. So these cover all things to do with rotational, mob grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, so AMP grazing, tall grass grazing, MIG, management intensive grazing, high density, ultra high density, total grazing. There are so many names that reflect slightly different variations of this theme of moving animals on after you've grazed. So, but the main thing is to remember that it's a graze and it's a rest, and that the rest and recovery is as important, if not more so, than the grazing event itself. And I think that's the real difference between sort of a conventional sort of set stock system, where animals are turned out and just left, where actually the focus there is just about, you know, how much grass can you give them and how long will it last? And they're just going to be there eating whatever's there until it's all gone. Graze and rest systems really do think about building rest, particularly into the growing season. And that's the really important bit. If we rest our grassland over the winter, it's not going to be as effective as resting it during the growing season, because grass goes dormant in the winter. Whereas if we're resting it during the growing season, it's actively cycling nutrients, it's actively engaged in the carbon cycle, which means that we get a lot more benefit. Okay, so as I said, graze and rest, and time is a key determinant of impact, not always the number of animals. People often think if you have too many animals somewhere, you're going to create overgrazing. You can have a lot of animals in an area, but as long as you move them on quickly, then you're not necessarily going to overgraze, and as long as you don't bring them back too quickly. But time really is the key determinant of impact. And I know all of you will probably have seen at some point a field with a horse in it, one animal, looks like it's got plenty of space. I can pretty much guarantee that the grass will have been overgrazed. So time is the key determinant of impact often, particularly in terms of grazing impact rather than the number of animals. As I said, we're particularly going to be focusing on kind of mob grazing, AMP grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, which is short duration, high density grazing, followed by a fairly long period of rest. But that period of rest can be really adaptable, and it can change during the year, or it can change to meet the needs you have on your farm. But an example would be a 24-hour grazing period with 100 cows per acre, followed by 90 days rest before they come back onto that same paddock. That is not a recipe for how to do this, it's just an example. So a day's grazing with 100 cows on an acre, moving them on, and they don't come back for 90 days. That's the type of intensity that we're talking about. And so just to give a little bit of an understanding of how that relates to other grazing management approaches. So as I've already mentioned, set stocking is basically where you put your animals in a field and you just sort of leave them there, and they go out in the spring and they come back in the autumn usually. And just to highlight that, actually, you'll see in all of these images, which were brilliantly developed by Sarah Morgan, who was at Rothamsted and is now at Harper Adams University, it's the same number of animals in all the pictures. So it gives you an idea of how the grass around that grazing platform is being utilised. So as I said, in the set stocking situation, we don't need much infrastructure. We can have fixed watering points. It says low labour input. I would always challenge that, because I think actually at the point you then need to bring the animals in, potentially there's a significant hike in the amount of labour input required, and you may well, because they're always going back onto the same areas that they've been on, you're increasing the risk of parasite burden. So actually you're potentially going to be having to get them in more. You're going to have to be handling those animals. You might potentially having additional costs put in there as well. So low labour input in terms of managing the actual grazing, but that doesn't necessarily play out across the rest of the system. Then you've got continuous variable, which is pretty similar, but actually may just kind of move a few animals about here or there, or block a bit off, or, you know, so it's basically set stocking, but maybe taking a little bit more awareness of that's a boggy end of the field, so I'm going to just stop them from going there, or they've really poached that bit, so I'm going to stick a wire up just to keep them off it. So generally continuous, but with some variation. Then we have this relaxed rotational, where we're sort of using low to medium stocking numbers, stocking density, where, you know, we don't really have any control over the grazing pressure, but we are kind of creating some rest in the system. So we're putting the animals in 2 fields, and then maybe we're going to swap them into the other 2, and then maybe we're going to bring them back. Better than nothing. So I think, yeah, absolutely is, for me, better than set stocking, and you will definitely get an increase in grass productivity, but at the same time doesn't quite have the same benefits as maybe creating more rest in that system. Strip grazing, where you basically just have a front fence moving across the grassland, across the sward or the crop, really well known by many people, particularly as a winter strategy, so on a forage crop, for example, and often used, you know, you'll see many dairy farms using this as an approach. I think it's really great, and I'm actually strip grazing one of my groups of cattle at the moment across a grassland area that we're managing for curlew nestings as a habitat outcome. But in the growing season, I would always want to put a back fence up. Otherwise, they're just going to go back and start regrazing before the plants are ready behind them. And then this kind of modern grazing management, which is Sarah's term, and I would call it the kind of graze and rest system, which she also reflects here. We've got the hub and spoke. So this is a really great one if you don't want to invest in lots of new water troughs or different mobile water systems. You can create the same kind of approach by moving animals and separating them off and creating rest in the system, but having them come back to a single water point in each field. You will get potentially overgrazing around the water trough and probably significant poaching if it's wet, and you will increase the risk of, or increase the likelihood of having things like docks and thistles coming up around the water trough, because it will get compacted. But potentially you're only having that negative impact on the soil health in that small area, and actually you're able to create rest across the grazing platform. So as a kind of a way to start shifting towards this approach, then it can work really well. I would say though, however, and actually I would say someone who's doing this not too far from you guys, so Billy Lewis, who's in Herefordshire, saw him using this approach really successfully when I visited in the summer. And I would say that if you have horned cattle, having a narrow angle can be a problem sometimes. There are sometimes issues in that kind of point of the triangle, but if it's wide enough, then it should be fine. Paddock grazing, again, we're kind of increasing the intensity, if you like, of the management planning requirement, but also the infrastructure. We've shifted our water troughs into the middle of the field, which means that they can each serve 4 paddocks, and we've got our animals moving around. So again, we're building more rest. And then if we move on to mob grazing, you see that that can become even more, we've got even more opportunity to move those animals. If that was my farm, I wouldn't have those animals in 4 separate groups. I'd put them all into one and move them around. So yeah, but again, they might be split out for different management group reasons. But yeah, for me, having fewest groups as possible is better. And then cell grazing, we might in that instance be moving animals multiple times a day. So we're possibly going from, moving every 12 hours or every 8 hours, having these multiple moves. And it might be that we're taking that grass down a bit harder, or it could work really well in wet weather. So we're wanting to get across that grazing platform because we know that if we hold animals anywhere too long, they're going to make an awful mess. So hopefully those two slides give you an understanding of the overview of from kind of the spectrum of set stock right through to this more intensive multiple moves a day cell grazing. And the reason that we want to create this movement in the system is reflective of the kind of predator-prey relationship. So Alan Savory talks about this as being a key insight, is understanding that prey animals like cattle, like sheep, are super lazy. And if they're just left to kind of loaf and hang about in one place, they will. But actually, if we can introduce the predator pressure, which they evolved to kind of avoid and they evolved to live with, by introducing either, for example, a no fence collar or an electric fence, or if you're in that perfect position where your fields and your flock or your herd size perfectly aligned so you can just move them from field to field, basically moving those animals on reflects that predator pressure that they would have historically had as they evolved from their wild ancestors. So, and we also know that grasslands and grassland plants and, the whole kind of broad range of these plants like legumes, herbs, etc., co-evolved with our ruminants, co-evolved with our large herbivores. So they evolved to respond to a graze and then a rest as animals moved on in response to that predator. So what happens then is that the plant is able to be as optimally healthy as it possibly can be once it's had a bite or two, and then as it starts to recover, has the time to recover fully so that it doesn't have to draw on the energy in its roots. Now, in the growing season, I'm sure you're all aware that plants, through the action of photosynthesis, are able to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere due to the action of sunlight, and they are then able to turn that essentially into a sugary glucose, which then is turned into a carbon, and that goes into the soil, which they exchange. 30% of the energy in the plant goes into its roots, which are then exchanged with soil microbes, which then help that plant get all of the nutrients that it needs. Now, those nutrients are only going to be accessible if those roots are healthy. If we overgraze a plant, so the plant's been grazed, it's trying to regrow. As it's trying to regrow, and it is using some of that leaf material that's left as a solar panel, as it's trying to regrow, it gets bitten off again. So it's like, okay, I've got to try and grow again, gets bitten off again. Right, got to try and grow again. At the point where it doesn't have energy left to try and grow again, it then starts using energy stored in its roots. Remember, it put 30% of its energy down into those roots. So then as it starts to use energy from the root mass, those roots start to die off. Now, root death is totally normal. That's fine. We need necromass within the soil to help build our soil and increase our soil health. But if every single plant in a field is losing its roots because it's trying to recover, because it's been overgrazed, what we then have is a lack of soil health. We have a lack of air being able to get into the soil. We have a lack of nutrient exchange. We have a lack of carbon sequestration. So we need to make sure that we're not overgrazing so that our plants are able to be healthy, but also to enable them to engage in that underground, sub-ground level action of nutrient exchange, and also being able to create healthy soil that is supported and enabled by nutrient exchange between various microbes and the plants themselves. So we know that if grazed heavily, for example, animals are left on there and they take a plant right down. And again, if that's just within a very short period of time, because there's a lot of animals and they're competing for that bite, then rest can absolutely be the best way to support that. So rest is vital to ensure that field system as a whole system above and below ground is able to function. And the trampling of plants whilst grazing can really help feed the soil and increase organic matter. Now, when I first started doing this sort of grazing, I had very much hung up on that kind of a third mantra. So graze a third, trample a third, leave a third. That's changed for me over time. And I think that those of you who are already engaging in these sorts of grazing approaches will know that it's never a fixed hard and fast rule. But actually, you need to kind of adapt and change depending on the management outcomes that you're managing for. So that's the key kind of part of this is graze and rest, but understand what you're managing for so that you can tweak the graze and rest to shift you closer to those management goals. If we have continuous grazing over time, we are not going to end up with healthy soils that are able to function. And another way of just sort of showing that, you know, we've got, quite often you'll hear whatever's above ground is below ground. Not always the case, but generally it's a good indicator. But if we continue to keep allowing animals to continue to graze on a plant before it's ready to be regrazed, then we are effectively overgrazing. So I want to talk a bit about the power of rest, and hopefully this will give you a good overview of how that works in a fairly kind of concrete way that you're able to see quite visually. So let's say I've gone online and I've looked up what is the, you know, I've got this field, and I've looked online and it tells me that in this field I can have 10 cattle, and I can have them in there for 48 days. Whatever the size of this field is. I've worked out through going on Feed Smart, which I will a resource I'll share with you later, then I can have 10 cattle in here for 48 days. After that 48 days is up, I'm going to have to put them somewhere else, because there's only enough grass in here to last 10 cattle 48 days. So normally what I would do is, if I had audience participation available, I would be asking you how many days rest is available in here. Well, the answer, unfortunately, because this is a one-way conversation, is going to be 0. In that 48 days, I've got 48 days of grazing and I've got no rest. And I also potentially have the risk of overgrazing, because the animals, I have no way of controlling what the animals are eating or where they're eating it. So in those 48 days, there is no rest. If I just pop a fence in the middle of that field, I could put my 10 cattle on 24 days on one side, and then after the 24 days are up, I could put them on the other side. And basically what that means is that I then get 24 days of rest. So once I've gone from one side to the next side, I could potentially, if we're in the middle of the growing season, pop them back again. And actually I could probably go on like that for a little while. So my 48 days suddenly, you know, I've got 24 days and 24 days, but I could potentially get a few more days out by putting them back again. So already, just with that single fence and leaving it up once I've moved them through as a back fence, means that I can create rest in the system. Now, I'm going to get a little bit overexcited now with my electric fences, and I'll put another one up. So I've split my field into 4. This time I've got my 10 cattle, which are not to scale, by the way. So don't get worried if you think that they're kind of a bit too cramped in here. 12 days per paddock. So I'm then going to be building in over 30 days rest. 36 days rest is suddenly now going to be built into this system, which means that potentially once I've gone round those 4 and my 48 days is over, I can start going round again. Same again. And you get the picture as we go through. And in this instance, after my 48 days is over, I can go right back to the start and do another 48 days. So the more paddocks that we're able to create, the more subdivisions, the more we can move animals on, the more rest we're able to build into the system. And that's really, really important, because if I was thinking from a financial point of view, I've got this field earmarked for these 10 cattle, and after 40 days, I've had to put them, 48 days, sorry, I've had to put them somewhere else. If I don't have to put them somewhere else, and I've been able to keep them on here because I just go back round again, that other field that they were going to go to, I could maybe take a hay cut, a silage cut, haylage cut. I could put some other animals on it. So suddenly I'm increasing the potential carrying capacity of my farm, because wherever these guys were going to have to go after 48 days, actually, I can do something else with. We know from the research that Sarah Morgan has done is that these approaches increase the carrying capacity of our land, and they allow us to extend the growing season. And if we are working within a world of reduced subsidy, now I know many of you are in Wales, and the picture for what that's going to look like in the future is unclear, kind of as it is for us up here in Scotland. However, I think most of us could probably agree that our best options are to model our businesses with as little public support as possible, in terms of, you know, can we model our business to run without public subsidy of any sort, and then start thinking about how we can build that in. If we can do that, we're going to have resilience, regardless of which government are in power and what the policy looks like. So if we're able to create a longer grazing season, and we can potentially carry more animals without having to buy more land, we're making a significant difference to cash flow and to profit and loss on our businesses just by investing in some electric fence. So it's all very well and good saying, oh, we just need to chuck up some electric fences, but actually this does require quite a lot more work and needs us to plan a little bit more about what we're going to be doing. So the first thing is sorting out water. It is the reason why these systems often fail, and it always makes it very difficult for people to stick to these systems. So just in terms of kit, You don't have to kind of go out and get all of your water pipes kind of mold in. You don't need to suddenly spend loads and loads of money. What I would really recommend is if you're just going to start splitting some fields up, if you can do it in a field that's on a bit of a slope and hopefully the trough's at the top, hopefully, you could just run a blue pipe and almost siphon into a trough below it. So as simple as that, just to try and move water around and allow you to get that back fence up. There's loads of really great options for water troughs. And I really recommend having a look at the Progressive Farming Company. Their Kiwi Tech drag trough is hugely popular. They always sell out and you have to go on a waiting list to get them. But they're absolutely brilliant. They're really good on uneven ground. They have a spike which holds them in place, and so many good reviews about how well they work. So that's a really good piece of kit. We use a water pump from Ardo Water Solutions. It's the best £2,000 I've ever spent. It basically sits next to a water supply or water source, and it has a 3 meter, it needs to be 3 meters from the water, but then it has something like a 40-meter lift. So it can really, really make sure that you can get water about as much of the farm as you possibly can. You also need to take into account things like, are you on mains? Are you on natural supply? All of those things are quite complex and difficult to kind of get your head around. But once you do get there and you get a plan, then obviously you can start thinking about your grazing relating to that water availability. We sometimes use natural sources, so giving animals access to a burn for a day or two really isn't that much of a problem if it's quite a narrow space that you're allowing them to enter, and then you'll move them on the day after anyway. So some of those concerns about livestock access to water can really be mitigated through clever use of electric fence. But water, think about it, plan that. You also need to think about the length of time that they're going to be grazing for. So this is how often do you want to move your animals? So I would always say there's generally one of two fixed options when you're starting out that you want to go with. Either the size of the paddock or the frequency of the move. And I say this because if you can keep one of them fixed, then it just makes it a bit easier. You can kind of plan things a bit easier and it just gives you less to kind of get your head around. So for me, I'm not bothered about the size of the paddock, because it's super flexible, because everything is with electric fence. For me, it's the daily moves that become a really important kind of fixture in the day. And I want my animals to be moving as much of the year as possible every single day. So if I'm going to be thinking about daily moves, I need to work out what that daily feed allocation needs to be of grass in that paddock. And that's going to be the thing that tells me the size of the paddock. And I'm going to show you some resources to help you with that. The other thing you need to think about is the length of the recovery time. So when it is the summer, say it's, kind of early, when that grass really starts getting going, and it depends where you are in the country as to when that is. But that kind of warm, wet weather and the grass really starts cranking. Quite often people sort of say, oh, the grass is getting away from me, which I always think is a hilarious term, as if it's kind of running off into the distance. But that's the point where you almost want to be moving your animals more quickly. And when I say quickly, I mean you want to get them across the grazing platform in a quicker amount, in less time. So if you were planning that you were going to get from paddock A all the way around back to paddock A again, and it was going to be 80 days, well, actually, that's probably a bit too long at that time in the year when the grass is really growing fast. So what you would want to do is you might want to, if you're only moving once a day, give them bigger paddocks so they get across it more quickly. Or you might want to, if your paddock sizes stay regular, move them twice a day, possibly. So it might just be a way of thinking you need to do a bit of maths, need to plan out what size your paddocks are going to be and work out the length of recovery time. And then you can, as the grass growing season changes throughout the year, you change the amount of time. And this is where I feel like more than an hour is useful for this discussion, because sometimes this is the bit that people get a bit kind of hung up on, like how big do my paddocks need to be, how long do I need to graze them for, how long do I need to rest them for. But maybe that's something we can pick up at a later date when I'm hopefully going to come and do a visit locally. So this idea of grass allocation is, can be a bit tricky. Most of us who are engaged in these systems and have been doing it for a while do it all by eye, and you will get to that point. But basically, the easiest thing to do is to work out how much does each animal need per day. Livestock require about 2% of their body weight in forage per day. So if you don't know the weight of your animal, then there's plenty of resources online of places where you can go and get help for that. If you haven't got any way to weigh them, you can kind of guess it, and then you can kind of tweak the allocation depending on how well or not they're looking. So what you need to work out is how much do they need and how many kilograms of dry matter per hectare do I have? So you need to measure it. And then you need to determine what's the constant, as I said, the frequency of moves or the size of the paddock. There's a brilliant free resource on feedsmart.co.nz, so it's a New Zealand resource that will help you identify either how big your paddocks need to be or how frequently your animals need to move. And you can basically just put in the livestock class, whether it's sheep, whether it's cattle, what age they are, whether they're a mixed age group, and it will basically work it all out for you. So it's a really, really great resource when you're first starting out, just to kind of help you get confident and to get your eye in. And just wanted to kind of highlight, nice to see Emily in this photo, and it's probably one of the only places you're going to see sheep in this presentation, because I don't have any sheep photos. But there are two ways to kind of measure grass, or two kind of more accurate ways to measure grass. One is the sward stick, which you can get free if you're a levy payer from your levy body. Or you can use a plate meter like this one, or a plonker or donker, as some people call it, depending on where you are in the country. These generally both work best on almost monoculture ryegrass or maybe ryegrass clover mixes. The more complex and diverse your grassland gets, the less useful these bits of equipment are. And you'll see that, for example, the other options for measuring are the welly measure. That's my welly, and that's a way that I quite like to sort of measure grass, particularly at the beginning of the year, to sort of see whether it's cranking on or not. Grass takes a while to get going up here at 57 degrees north. And then you kind of get to the extreme end where you're using your truck to measure your grass height. This was Sarah Dusgate, who's working with Feps and Angus. So yeah, a sward stick just wouldn't work. Probably would just about work still with the welly measure, but it just wouldn't work in the photo that Sarah took there. And the plate meter definitely wouldn't be working in Sarah's photo. So depending on how far you push these systems, sometimes that kit just doesn't really become that useful. And just a quick overview of actually, how does the grass grow, which I guess is something that maybe many of you are very aware of already. So apologies if this is something you know already, but generally, unless you're in kind of the very southwest toe of England where they seem to have grass growing all year round, it's pretty dormant from November through to early March. Particularly that's the case up here. Our grass doesn't actually really start growing until May, so it'll still be dormant in April. And then in April, May, June, we kind of have that massive amount of growth in the grass. And then we go into this kind of summer slump. So the root growth is really active in the spring. And then it kind of slumps as it does in the middle with the plant growth. And then we do get this kind of autumn flush where we get root growth becomes less active before dormancy, but is still fairly active during that warm, wet weather that we tend to get in September and into October. And in some places you'll still be getting that now, and some of you will still have grass that is still growing. So we need to kind of think about, how do we move our animals if our grass is growing like this? Now, there's so many different things that we're going to be wanting to manage for. And I would say that 3 years ago, if I was delivering this, it was far more hard and fast. Because of the last 2 years, particularly in the southeast of England, where drought, and for many of us actually all over the UK, drought has been a significant problem. And now heavy rain events and flooding are becoming a significant problem. Farmers are really shifting how they are managing their grassland and aren't necessarily following the pattern of fast moves in the warm growing weather, slow moves in the dormant weather. I do some webinars with a farming and protected landscapes project in the Kent Weald, and two of the brilliant farmers on that webinar last night, who I've been kind of working with for a few years now, were talking about how they've completely shifted their grazing management, where they're really, regardless of the time of year, building a very high stockpile in front of them. They are having, they've got really high grazing, really high numbers, high stocking rate across the farm. And so they just slow the animals down as much as possible and create as much of a stockpile for as much of the year as they possibly can, create as much rest in the system as they can, and are more content to buy in hay and feed that throughout the year, because they're essentially bringing carbon and nutrients onto the farm from somewhere else, rather than kind of try and follow the grass growth curve. And I think that is in response to drought and to that heavy rain, and they just feel like they've got much more flexibility to cope with a drought with tall grass. And then if we've got really wet weather, it's holding the animals up much better. So yeah, as I said, over the last few years, these things really have changed in response to the challenges we're all facing from the climate changing. You know, and I kind of exist at the extreme end of this stuff. I do have small cattle, and this are just heifers, but yeah, we like the grass to get really, really tall, because it really contributes to our aims around biodiversity, soil health, etc. But basically, if the grass is growing fast, we tend to speed up those moves. When the grass grows slows, we do slow them down. And there's some really lovely examples from Clive Bright on kind of how this looks in terms of practice. So if we have fast grass growing and we move slowly, what ends up happening is a lot of the grass ahead of us goes to seed. What normally happens then is we decide to cut it. And then because it's been cut at a point in the year where actually we probably should have slowed down to then speed up, it then doesn't recover. If we have slow growth and we move too quickly, we are going across the grazing platform so fast that actually we then, when we come back to the start, nothing has recovered. If we have no growth, what we end up doing is basically housing early. And he suggests at the bottom that if we've got fast growth and we move quickly, we're able to move at the same rate as the grass, which means that we're kind of creating more structural and plant diversity whilst giving plants the opportunity to flower. If we have slow growth and we move slowly, then we end up with this kind of mixed bite towards the end of the year where some of it's a nest and some of it hasn't, but we've still got something to come back to at the end. And if we have no growth, we just really, really go slowly to have that long grazing season. So we do have that opportunity to kind of try and match the grass growth, but you have to be careful about the risk of untoward acceleration, which is basically where you start moving your animals too quickly and the grass hasn't recovered, which is something, if you're interested in, really read the book Grass Productivity by Andre Vaussin. None of this is new. He was writing about this in the 50s when he talks about the risks of untoward acceleration. Again, just another way of thinking about how we're going to graze throughout the year, what that's going to look like. So in the new spring growth, we're going to be getting those animals skimming through. That's how I like to manage it in the spring. I don't want them taking it down too hard. I just want them to take a bite and then we're moving on. So we don't want to hit that grass too hard. We want to monitor the growth rate of the grass. And at all times, we want to look to our animals to make sure that they're well and that they're healthy. And potentially, I would rather buffer feed, so give conserved forage like hay in the spring rather than feeding that too early in the autumn. In the late spring, once that grass is really pumping, we're going to speed those moves up. We're going to move those animals more quickly, possibly more frequently. We're going to give them bigger paddocks potentially. And then as the grass growth slows down and the seed heads and flowering is happening, we're going to leave longer residuals. We might start deferring some for hay, standing hay as a stockpile. And we're coming back onto the grass that we grazed first at that point. In the autumn, again, as I said, we can hurry up a little bit with those moves. And then in the winter, we can really, really go slowly. We can start grazing without a back fence just to make it easier to get back to water, particularly if you need a fixed water trough. You don't want to be running pipes out and things at the risk of frost. So yeah, if you can in the winter, you know, that's when you really want to slow everything down and potentially start adding in possibly bale grazing to the mix. What I would say is that if you want to outwinter your animals in a way that they are optimizing stockpiled forage, and they're not kind of just, you know, you're not using like a sacrifice field where they're standing next to a feed wagon. If you want to outwinter in a way that is predominantly supported by grass and is possibly using bale grazing, you have to get your rotation right earlier in the year. So we manage, as I said, our animals outside all year round. Winter planning starts in May. So we're always, or even earlier, you know, we're always thinking about the following winter. So now is not the time to think, oh, can I start outwintering? It really has to be way, way in advance, because all of the decisions you make through the growing period are going to relate back to how you're able to manage over the winter. Conscious of time, so we've got about 5 minutes left. So just to go back through, sorry, I've got a dog trying to get through a stairgate here, bear with me. So we've got some key concepts. A back fence, as I said, is key to rest and recovery. The more paddocks we're able, the more subdivisions we're able to do, the more paddocks we're able to create with back fences, then the more rest we're able to get in. The frequency of our moves ideally relates to grass growth speeds. However, given the challenges that we found in climatic shifts over the last couple of years, you need to do what works for you and predominantly think about what am I managing for. As I said, rest can help extend the grazing season, and taller covers can create greater diversity, which helps us both in terms of the diversity of species, but also structural diversity, all of which is going to help us in a changing climate, but also making sure that we're meeting any of those kind of biodiversity outcomes that we're going to be looking for. I also just want to touch on the ideas around animal health and welfare. So, and just as an example, this photo, this is what I want to be stockpile grazing onto. So this is what our animals are moving onto just now. It's a really nice mix of green and brown, no soil visible, plenty of biomass. So when it absolutely pours down with rain, as it seems to have been for the last month, they've got plenty of biomass there to hold them up. And they've also got plenty to eat, and that mix of fibre and protein is going to give them a good full belly. So taller swards encourage animals to graze above the parasite zone, which reduces the risk of parasite burden. Not the case for all parasites, but predominantly that will be a benefit. We have not had to give any wormers in 5 years. We fecal egg count frequently, and I'm absolutely convinced that those daily moves is absolutely what's doing the trick for us. A mixed bite, as I said, that protein green, that fibre brown, helps regulate rumen function. There's no point in pumping a load of high energy grass and proteinous grass into animals if they can't do anything with it. If it just comes out as runny water at the back end, then they're not actually optimizing that forage. So it's important to have something else in there to help them hold it in the rumen for a bit longer. And animal health and welfare should always take priority, such as shade, shelter, grass availability, over any other issues that you might be managing for. So, for example, if you are if you've got animals in the middle of a shadeless and windless field, because that's where your grazing plan has taken them in the middle of July or August, and those animals are getting heat stressed, then absolutely the priority is to move those animals to somewhere they can either get a breeze or they've got some shade. So quite often there's an argument against mob grazing that it isn't natural, although it is predicated upon the idea of predator-prey relationships, but that, you know, animals aren't able to choose where they are or what they do. If they are, if you, what, you know your animals, you watch them. If they don't look happy, if they're pacing, if they're not comfortable, if they're panting because they're heat stressed, if they're hunched because they're cold and wet, think about moving them. They're the things that are making money on your farm. So, or should be. So you don't want to put them at risk. You need to make sure that they're healthy and well. So do not ever prioritize anything else above health and welfare. However, that said, what we do want to do to ensure that we're able to make the best possible genetic selections is to push our animals a little bit. So we have to find that fine balance between environmental challenge to ensure that we can breed the best animals suitable for our site, whilst also ensuring that we're not putting their health and welfare at risk. And that, again, is a whole other conversation to have separately. What I would say is that taller swards create a cooler environment, which is beneficial in hot weather, can help animals reduce the risk of heat stress. And also in 2022, when there was that significant drought, many people who were tall grass grazing were amazed at how much dew was able to collect on the plants, and actually their grass was able to, although it looked kind of dry and brown at the top, at the bottom had a green flush in the base of the sward, because dew was able to be caught and get down into the bottom of the plant, and those plants were obviously able to have water. So there's a lot of things in that kind of tall grass stuff that really helps in wet weather to hold animals up, and in dry weather to ensure that the plants are able to get some water. So I guess just a few photos of kind of, you know, what grass is looking like. So this would be kind of I guess end of May going into June. Up here in Aberdeenshire, lots of docks, one of my favourite plants. Our animals eat them quite happily, though I know some people don't have that same experience. I guess this is actually that last photo. This would be what we were going into. So yeah, this is probably June actually, what we're going into in June. And these are the residuals. This is what we're leaving behind. Now, for some people, this is what they're going into. But for us, in June, the size of platform and the animals that we have and how we're moving around, that this is absolutely, we're happy to leave that behind. We will come back to it if we need to, but actually this will then get a nice long rest so that it can recover. Later in the year, these are kind of our autumn grazing pictures. So on the left, actually that's a residual in the autumn that we may then come back onto later in the winter if it's frosty with a bale, for example. And again, on the right-hand side, these are the kind of covers that we would be working with in the autumn. And actually, I think that paddock, that's a photo of a paddock mid-graze. So there's a bit that has been eaten and some that hasn't. As I mentioned, docks do take a bit of a battering on our farm or on the land that we graze. So you can see along this hedge line, so this was 24 hours after. So we put them in, they went through, ate all the docks. They've also eaten all of the leaf out of the ones on the left-hand side of the photo. That you can see the docks at the top of the photo on both sides. There's a significant change in the amount of how many leaves there are there. So I think by creating more competition within the grazing platform, the animals have this less selective grazing. We also don't really give our animals many minerals, so they go to seek out those plants, and docks are incredibly high in magnesium, which, as we all know, is important. Okay, I'm going to finish in just 1 minute, but just want to say that, yeah, electric fence can be really cheap. I much prefer Kiwi Tech, which are the lovely white modular posts. But if you want to just get started, then these plastic posts, which you can pick up like 10 for 12 quid or something from your local agricultural supply store, are ideal. Anything that can help you kind of get started. Though I would recommend with reels, you go for like and don't go for the cheapest, because they're always just crap and they always break. Go for something like middle of the road, potentially geared if you can, just because it's going to make your life easier. We can use dung as a way to score and check the kind of health of the animals and whether they're getting everything that they need from the grass that they're on. So this is a pretty much perfect pat. You can see that it's round, it's got concentric circles. So as it is dropped, it is kind of dropped in a slow clap. And in the middle of the pat, there's this slight dip, and then with a bit of a slick across the top of it. And that is telling me that those animals are getting absolutely everything that they need in that field, that rumen function is good, that they are getting a good fill, and that they are optimally able to digest whatever they're being fed. And that is it. So I am going to stop sharing, and I can see that we've got a little bit in the Q&A. We have one question.
Cool. Jake is gonna get your questions in. Thank you very much, Nikki. Jake is gonna our glamorous assistant, you might remember him from the first event. He'll pop up in a minute and ask the questions. Yeah, thank you, Nikki. Fantastic as always. And I think when I attended the event earlier this year, the thing that kind of focused my mind or sort of helped me massively was your point about managing for outcomes. Because I was like, how do I manage daily moves? It's not for me, and all this sort of stuff. And actually, if you, like you say, if you manage it for yourself, not for perhaps what you think it should be, then that massively helps. And you do get your iron. And yeah, some weeks I get it completely wrong, and other weeks I get it right. So you learn as you go, don't you? Which is great. My question to kick off would be, I mean, for me, geared reels made a massive difference to how I did things and how much easier it was to set up. They also make wonderful birthday presents, although I got called boring for asking for those for birthday presents. What bits of kit, or what one bit of kit would you say is your must-have to get started?
Oh, it's some reels and posts. Like if you can't do anything else, even if you're having to kind of wagon wheel off, you know, that kind of hub and spoke model off a fixed trough, then just the cheapest reel and the cheapest posts and an energizer are going to really help. But if you're going to go out and buy an energizer, please, please, please buy extra earthing rods. The biggest reason why people kind of go, oh, my sheep don't stay behind electric fence, it's usually sheep, not cattle, is that they haven't got it earthed well enough. So if you look at the Powered Pasture website, which is Alex Brewster's company based up in Perthshire, Rotational, they have some really good guidance on like how many earthing rods you need per length, or I think per however long your electric fence is. So if in doubt, put extra earthing rods in. And if you're worried about connecting them up, you can always, I use jump leads, you know, like for car jump leads, just to connect up my earthing rods. So you can kind of have a chain of them. And that's really going to make sure that that you're going to get a decent kick from that electric fence. If you just have one, then it's probably not going to be enough. So that's the key thing. Like, yeah, a sort of starter kit of energizer. I would really recommend investing in a solar setup for your powered, you know, solar battery and energizer. I wouldn't go for the like funny little integrated solar and battery. I'd go for like car battery that connects into a solar panel. I think Voss do a really nice kind of all-in-one box that basically held together, and it has a padlock option on it as well, because I know that for some people that's an issue. And then that just connects to several, ideally at least 2, probably 3 or 4 earth stakes, like a meter deep to go into the ground. And then onto whatever poly wire you can get and electric fence posts. So that definitely is the big bit of kit. However, I would say for 4 years, we were doing all of this on gravity-fed water. I cannot believe how much of a difference a solar water pump has made to my life. Like, it has made so much of a difference. So yeah, those are the good bits of kit.
Cool. And I think there's always grants available, and for us in Wales, speak to Farming Connect, have a chat with Lisa, who's our Monmouthshire coordinator. So yeah, there's always things going on. Jake, are you there? Have you got any questions?
I'm here. Yeah, great. Thanks, Nikki and Scott. So is that precious few questions so far, and I can see quite a lot of you here, and I'm sure more of you must have questions. So yeah, if you can use that Q&A function, and let's make the most of Nikki for the next 10 minutes. So foot problems. So a couple of our attendees have talked about experiencing foot problems this year, particularly with woody swards. So thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess if one of the challenges that you've let the grass get really high and that it's kind of senesced and you're concerned about foot problems, there's kind of key things that I would do in that instance is I would probably manage my rotation so the animals are moving around quicker so that that grass isn't getting as tall. So although, you know, I kind of really am a big fan of tall grass grazing, it doesn't work for everyone. And I think we need to be clear, exactly as Scott said, about what are we managing for. So if one of the things that we're managing for is a grass length that doesn't create this kind of woody senesced sward, then you need to think about changing your rest periods and moving your animals so that it doesn't get to that point. That would be the first thing in terms of grazing planning. Secondly, if you do want to have those taller swards, and there are people very successfully grazing sheep with taller swards, you might want to then start thinking more about, are these, you know, is it just a few animals? If it is, I'm pretty ruthless in terms of, you know, whether the animal should be in the system or not. Maybe that then becomes for you part of your culling policy. So you might decide, actually, I've got animals that need to thrive in the system that they're in, and any that can't or have got problems either with feet or whatever else it is, aren't going to stay in the system. They're going to be sold on or curled or whatever. So I think, yeah, you could either take an approach that is kind of, you know, depending on what you're managing for. So if you want to manage for taller swards for whatever reason, you know, related to biodiversity potentially, or, you know, that's the situation that you're in, fine. But I think expecting our sheep who actually evolved on mountainsides with fairly rocky ground to cope with that, if we haven't made those genetic selections, is a big ask. So maybe we need to start making those genetic selections now. We maybe not, as I said, cull out those animals that aren't performing, or we need to change our grazing management so that the sward doesn't get to that state, as it were. So that would be my immediate answer, sorry, to that.
Great, thank you. And earlier you mentioned as well how horned cattle may struggle within the hub and spoke system. And now we hear about how, you know, the genetics are really important to, you know, if you plan to graze on those woody swards. So how important are your breeds and genetics to the systems you choose? And are there resources that people can refer to see what the best systems might be for their particular circumstance? Or, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not, in terms of resources, I guess, probably there's no explicit resources around that. I would suggest, well, there is a brilliant WhatsApp group, a Mob Grazing UK WhatsApp group, which I'm admin for. If any of you want to join that, if you maybe contact Scott, he can kind of connect us and sort out swapping numbers to get you on that group. It's amazing. There's so much information on there. That's a really good place because there will always be somebody there who's been through the same issue that you're inevitably trying to resolve. What I would say is that yeah, I mean, just observe your animals. There was a really interesting article, I think, from New Zealand a couple of years ago that was like, oh, these people tried regen ag and they tried mob grazing and it didn't work. There were lots of, you know, I'm not going to make judgments about those people because I don't know the detail, but in the way it was presented by the journalist, there were lots of alarm bells in that system that were ringing that maybe those people could have responded to more quickly. So they were saying like animals weren't settling, or animals were kind of displaying aggressive behavior towards each other. They weren't happy in their social structure. They were pacing the fence. So I think observe your animals, and if they're not content and if they're not happy, then you need to change something in the system. As I said, we run a mixed group of horned and polled cattle, and having any kind of narrow point within the paddock, just we were having animals breaking out and they were getting bullied into that corner point by the dominant animal. So making sure that we don't have narrow angles in any of our paddocks has become really important to us, and our animals are just really chilled out and they really have a very happy kind of social structure. It also means we probably have slightly bigger paddocks than we might if they were all polled, for example, but that's fine. You know, it's really important to us that those animals that are horned remain horned. That's what we're managing for. for somebody else, they might want to manage for something differently. So yeah, I think coming back to that point that Scott identified, this idea about identify what it is you want to achieve has to be the primary goal. And I've really kind of been trying to build that into every decision that we make. And if you're interested in kind of exploring that concept further, I really recommend doing the Holistic Management Fundamentals course with 3LM, because it will really help you to understand, actually identify what it is you're managing for, and then your grazing planning can kind of fit in around that, rather than setting up this rigid grazing plan and then being like bloody miserable because it's not working and you're not able to achieve the outcomes that you set out to do.
Cool. That's great. Thank you. So just a reminder there. So Nikki mentioned this, the Holistic Grazing WhatsApp group. So if anyone's interested in joining that, please let Scott know. Obviously, a plug for our own Facebook group as well. So, you know, if you do have kind of questions and want to share thoughts, you know, that Facebook group hopefully will be a great place to discuss these issues kind of in a very local context. Scott, is there anything final from you?
I could probably talk to Nikki about grazing all the time. I mean, if you could carry on, so I'm thinking about myself now. I'm currently still rotationally grazing the sheep, and I have got small numbers and are sort of woefully understocked, which is great for me. I'm planning on rotationally grazing all through winter if I can. Is that the right thing to do, or should I maybe just move to strip grazing? Does it matter? Am I better off rotationally grazing?
I think it depends on what you're managing for, but water would be a key one. So like if it's, I don't know how frosty it gets with you, and it can change depending on like the field you're in, if it's particularly sheltered and like the sun doesn't get to it. But if you're struggling with water, then yeah, strip grazing is fine and they can come back to the water. Don't worry about it. And then maybe just follow up. Potentially you could follow up with a back fence if you really needed to, or you could create a laneway. So that's another really good way to kind of manage it, so that the animals are moving paddock every day, that there's a laneway back to the water. And I know that that is something that some people might worry about, the poaching and the kind of soil health damage issues around the laneway. But if it is a small area and actually enables you to meet your other goals by moving them across the paddock elsewhere, then, you know, that's a decision for each person to make on their own. I think, yeah, strip grazing, my favorite time of grazing is the kind of 60 days that we have on this particular bit of grazing that the cattle are on at the moment, because it is just every few days we're moving that fence ahead of them, and then we follow it up a few days later. And we just see really good outcomes where we're managing for that way to graze grassland. So yeah, I think it really depends. Like if you like moving your animals every day and putting a back fence up, you crack on and do that. If you don't want to because it's too much effort and you've got water issues, strip graze them. During the dormant season, you have a lot more leeway in what you can do. The challenge comes when the grass is growing.
Oh, right. And sorry, have you seen that one, Jake, about the solar pump? So you've said your solar pump is fantastic.
I was both going to give a final. We have a final question, and just before we go into that question, I just want to give a quick announcement. So on the 8th of December, we're going to have a farm walk coming up in Brecon, which is all around exploring cover crops. So details of that, when available, are going to be shared in the Facebook group. But yeah, if you want to save the date, the 8th of December, farm walk exploring cover crops. And then a last one or maybe two for you, Nikki. So advice on choosing a solar water pump.
The only one that I have used is Ardo. They're based in Aberdeenshire, but Peter Thorpe, who runs Ardo Water Solutions, is amazing. He sends them all over the country. Thoroughly recommend. I haven't used others, but I would definitely keep going back to Peter, and I recommend him to other people. And then I can see there's another question that asks about recommendations for shade in drought conditions for a more short-term solution other than trees which take a while to grow. I would suggest that if you don't have shade, find where there's a breeze. So I quite often in really hot weather, I'm like, oh God, I need to give the cattle some shade. They don't want it. They want to sit where there's a breeze. So if you can give them somewhere where there is a bit of a breeze, that's ideal. I appreciate that that isn't always possible. And when you are in those extreme conditions where there's no shade and there's no breeze, get them into some shade. Like just move them to somewhere where there's some shade, and then maybe, you know, walk them out so they can graze at night and they're in the shade in the day. Just, you know, if you're in really kind of horrible conditions, then you might just need to completely change your system for that moment. I can also see that, oh, there's quite a bit of noise going on in the background. I'm just going to mute Scott. I can also see that there was, I think Jessie has said yes, please, to the WhatsApp group. So Jessie, if you want to liaise with Scott, then we can get that sorted and I can get you added.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. I am here. I'm just, my interior light's gone off in my car and I can't get it back on again. So thank you very much, Nikki. That's fantastic. I will just pop my email address into the chat before we close the meeting. So if anyone wants to join the group, send me an email and I will pass your details on to Nikki. But Nikki, once again, thank you very much. And we will get you down to Wales, where it's not quite as frosty as Scotland most of the time. And yeah, we'll come and do a practical event on a farm, which we can then sort of see all this in detail, and we'll go from there. But no, Nikki,
Amazing.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you very much for everyone who's joined. Thank you, Jake, for doing the questions, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.